and welcome. My name is Robert Fenwick Elliott, and this is the second of my podcasts. I wasn't sure, to be honest, that there was going to be a second podcast. I did the first one partly just to test the fact that I've got a smart new microphone and a smart new camera. This being really because when I appear in court, it's increasingly on an audio-visual basis. And I don't know, but when I see my opponents appear on just a camera which is in their laptop or their whatever, it kind of looks unimpressive, I have to say. And I don't know whether they get paid less attention because it looks so amateurish. Perhaps yes, perhaps no. But it is interesting that the psychologists who have an interest in advocacy as a subject remark that these subconscious things about how we appear when we're trying to persuade someone of something are remarkably persuasive, and it's not merely the words and the logic that we use, but a whole load more. So anyway. Rightly or wrongly, I thought it was a good idea to get a proper camera and to get a proper microphone and I've even got some lights. I don't know whether you can see any lights, but I have some lights. So anyway, this podcast is a news review. That's the idea. So where do we start today? It's the 1st of January 2022. I did actually wake up early this morning, just after 2 o'clock, and I woke up with something in my subconscious saying, at 2 seconds past 2 o'clock, it's going to be a special day. Is that right? 02, 02, 01, 2022. I suppose it'll be even more special in February, I guess. But whether I will want to wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 2nd of February is open to conjecture. The news. A lot of the newspapers, I start with the Times, but there are several newspapers, focus on the fact that Tony Blair is at long last getting a knighthood, long after he was Prime Minister. He's getting the Order of the Garter, which is a species of knighthood, unusually in the gift of the Queen and not as recommended by the Prime Minister or the leader of the opposition. And what I think is probably the most remarkable about the award is not so much how Tony Blair stands today. He's widely castigated as a war criminal for his invasion of Iraq in the second invasion of Iraq. Nobody, I think, quarrels very seriously with the first invasion of Iraq, which was to expel Iraq from Kuwait. Cynics will say, of course, that the only reason the West bothered about the fact that Iraq had disgracefully invaded Kuwait was that Kuwait's got a lot of oil, and the West wanted to protect their interests, and I'm sure that's true. But equally, it was a perfectly justified war on the basis that nation states should not go around invading their neighbours, and if they do, it's perfectly justifiable for the international community to put them back in their box, and that is precisely what happened in the first Iraq war. Saddam Hussein was not ejected from power, he was merely ejected from Kuwait. His armies were driven back and the West left him alone. A parallel, you might think, with the war of 1812, a curious war, 1812, between Britain and the United States. Difficult to see really what it was all about. There are a number of East Coast states who quite seriously thought that they might fight the war on the side of Britain rather than the comparatively fledgling state or fledgling union of the USA, the United States of America, not actually that united in those early days. and I remark upon it for a couple of reasons. Like the Western forces in Iraq, the Brits who won did not press home their advantage, and they conquered quite a bit of United States territory, but gave it all back. It's true that the Brits took Washington and they burned down, or at least scorched, was more accurately I think would say, scorched the White House, which is why the White House is white after the Brits left, rather than leave it as a black sootened remains. The Americans painted it white to cover up the fact that it had been ransacked by the British. But interestingly, the British didn't touch any private property in Washington at all. They merely gave the Americans a bit of a bloody nose. The Americans, of course, tried to invade Canada, one of 3 attempts by the United States to invade Canada over the years, all of them unsuccessful. This was really the first American attempt to invade Canada, entirely unsuccessful, as it turned out. But Canada did not retaliate by seeking the United States territory in any way. And I think really the only lasting thing about the British victory over America in the War of 1812 was that they captured the flagship of the American Navy, the SS President, and renamed it the HMS President. It's the only time that subject to what I'm about to say, the only time that the British have had a ship in the Royal Navy called the HMS President, and they sailed this vessel up and down the east coast of America, doing nothing much, but for several years, really as a reminder to the Americans just to mind their manners, I think you'd say. And when it eventually fell into disuse, it got too old, the British replaced it with another ship, HMS President, the second HMS President, which also sailed up and down the east coast of America, again for no reason at all, but to remind the Americans of the need to have regard to their manners, which is, I guess, a kind of a modest way of reminding the vanquished of their status. It didn't last, of course. A century later, by 1918, it was perfectly clear that America was the dominant power in the world and had considerably overtaken the English in that regard. Anyway, I go into this history really just by way of comparison between the first Iraq War, perfectly proper war, and the second, based on the falsehood that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. He didn't. Did Tony Blair know that he didn't? Well, that's an interesting question. Tony Blair may well be a sort of neo-religious character who has a sort of a belief in what he wants to be true. But in any event, as we now know, Saddam Hussein did not have any weapons of mass destruction, and the effect of Tony Blair's war against Iraq, not entirely his war, it has to be said. The Americans were probably the instigators, well, they were the instigators of the second Iraq war, but query whether it would have been conducted with the same verve without the enthusiastic support of Tony Blair. Interesting, by the way, how in the UK it tends to be Labour parties who get into war, and in the United States it tends to be the Democrats, not the Republicans, who are most eager to get into war. Not always, of course, but on the whole, that seems to be the case. So anyway, whether or not you regard Tony Blair as a war criminal for the very large numbers of deaths needlessly caused by the second Iraq war, what's really remarkable about his knighthood is not that he's been granted a knighthood, but that it took so very long, and by who? So he could have been given a knighthood this time around, or put on the list by Boris Johnson, no. By Keir Starmer, no. Or earlier, it could have been his successor, Gordon Brown. No, he didn't nominate him. Neither did David Cameron. Neither did Theresa May. So this particular species of knighthood, the Order of the Garter, is in the gift of the Queen. It's the Queen who decides, and it was the Queen who decided, it seems, that Tony Blair should get his knighthood. Maybe she didn't actually want him to have his knighthood, but the convention is that until one former Prime Minister gets his knighthood, subsequent Prime Ministers don't get theirs either. So it's perfectly possible that there may have been those who would have thought that it was necessary to clear the logjam, so to speak, so that Tony Blair's successors can get their knighthoods, or in the case of Theresa May, her damehood. Interestingly, Andrew Neil, and I'll come back to him in a little while, on Twitter has remarked on the point and said that he was offered better, by which one presumes that he was offered a peerage. He may or may not have been. We merely have the hint from Andrew Neil in that regard. One wonders whether he is right in saying that it's not for journalists to accept awards, because it's the role of journalists to hold governments to account, and they cannot properly do that if they are beholden to a government which has conferred an honour. I say one hesitates about that because although Andrew Neil was wholly wrong recently in his condemnation of people who decided not to get vaccinated against COVID-19, on the whole he's a sound chap, and one has to think that he would be a useful contributor in the House of Lords if he were to be given a peerage. And in particular, if he were to get to the House of Lords as a crossbencher, which is where one suspects he would be most happiest, one would hope and expect that his line of questioning of government ministers of whichever complexion would be a good deal more rigorous and searching than most of what they experience. Other knighthoods and damehoods, 1/5 of them go to those who have been in the war against COVID, generals in the war against COVID, and one has to suspect that what we are now seeing as COVID disappears as an issue, and again I'll come back to that in just a few moments, we're going to be seeing a sort of splodge of defensive measures where the overreaction to COVID is defended probably for many years, if not decades to come. I say the war against COVID is over. I've remarked a few weeks ago, or a little while ago, a couple of weeks, I forget, that the tide had turned in respect of COVID. The reality seems to be overwhelmingly evidenced by South Africa and indeed other places, that the Delta variant, which was a nasty little bug, has been effectively supplanted in South Africa and more or less now everywhere else as time rolls by Omicron, call it what you will, which is a much milder disease. Really, it seems no more severe than flu. Every winter, colds and flu kill people. That has ever been thus, and will probably continue. But in any event, Omicron seems to be our saviour, and there may be a lengthy period of time before COVID is treated as having been defeated, but it's not, it seems, going to be realistically a threat. And the ridiculous reaction by the Scots, for example, and indeed the South Australians in imposing fresh measures smacks of the sort of desperation of Nazi Germany in the Second World War, where they were appointing generals who were 21 or extraordinarily young, naive kids to generalships in the army in some mad, desperate attempt to pretend that the war was still on. Also honoured Daniel Craig, who gets a CMG. Interestingly, the CMG is the same honour which the fictional James Bond had in the Bond novels, and of course Daniel Craig played Bond in several movies. One has to rather approve of that. It's kind of American in the sense, in the sort of custard tradition that fact and fiction get merged together in a sort of entertainment mulch. But we approve of Daniel Craig getting a CMG, and we also particularly approve of Joanna Lumley being made a dame. You might say we already knew that she was a dame. Wonderful woman, wonderful. She gets her award for her championship of the Gurkhas. Absolutely right. The Gurkhas deserve her support. They deserve the support of the British government, which they have not been getting. And Joanna Lumley is not only lovely and great, but also good. So entirely right that Joanna Lumley gets her damehood. Also appearing in many newspapers are reports of the New Year celebrations. I have to say I find it difficult to be really attracted by New Year celebrations. I've always thought that the best way to welcome in the New Year is not half drunk in some ghastly party on New Year's Eve, but by waking up on New Year's Day relatively happy, sober, and I'm not against a glass. Here we go. This is my New Year glass. There we go. But anyway, there are plenty who do enjoy going out on the Raz on New Year's Eve, but not, it seems, this year in Scotland, where Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish government have cracked down, notwithstanding all the evidence that COVID is no real risk anymore. They are having their last hurrah and effectively banned New Year celebrations, with the somewhat predictable result that the Scots, who are intent on having a good time, have driven down to Newcastle and other Scottish cities to have a party there. Again, the press, particularly those opposed to the SNP, really quite critical of Nicola Sturgeon. They refer to as wee cranky, which is not a particularly polite term. Poison dwarf is another slightly unkind reflection of her diminutive stature. On any test, she's not been good news on any real test. She hasn't delivered independence for the Scots, which is probably a good thing for the Scots. But anyway, be that as it may, she's been unsuccessful, and on almost every metric, the governance of Scotland has been a disaster since devolution. Drug use way up, poverty up, education down. I mean, almost everything good has become less so, and almost everything bad has become more so. There are, of course, those who think that another referendum on Scottish independence would be welcome, and I'm referring particularly to the English who think that they should have a part in such a referendum. And there is at least some evidence that quite a few English people would vote for Scottish independence as a way, in effect, of expelling them from the United Kingdom. Whether the Scots would welcome the vote being extended to the English and thereby being expelled is another matter. And also another matter, of course, is what happens to the residents of the Shetlands and Orkney, where, if current polls are to be believed, at least half the residents of those islands so distrust the SNP and Scottish government that they would much prefer to be associated in some way with Westminster than with an independent Scotland, perhaps obtaining a status not dissimilar from the Channel Islands or the Isle of Man. That is a matter which has quite a bit of significance, not perhaps quite so much as the days when oil was oozing so profusely out of the seabed of the North Sea, but nevertheless the fishing quotas and rights which would attach to an independent Orkney and Shetland, not to mention the Western Isles, who the Outer Hebrides and so forth, who might very well take a similar stance. That would very much shoot the SNP's fox if those islands were indeed given a vote and if they voted to be part of a united kingdom and not part of an independent mainland Scotland. We turn next to the Daily Mail, a paper which is not always entirely serious, but does have an interesting article by Andrew Neil. Before getting to that, it is kind of bizarre. They have this sort of line down the right-hand side with usually pictures of women not wearing much. And this one, I'm not quite sure why, attracted my attention. Maura Higgins flaunts her pert posterior in a skimpy brown bikini as she enjoys an outdoor shower in the Maldives in sultry Snap. Now, I've got absolutely no idea who Maura Higgins is, or for that matter, why she deserves to be on the same page as a serious comment by a serious journalist, but that is how it is, and whether it's the boys or whether it's the girls or grown-ups of either sex who find that attractive, I don't know. But anyway, that's how it is. More importantly, for our purposes, Andrew Neil has written an article today. Can Boris usher in a new dawn in Downing Street? He ended the year assailed from all sides and with ratings plummeting, but Andrew Neil says the PM can still turn it around and defy critics predicting his downfall. The article itself is slightly less certain in its predictions here, and Andrew Neil says that he thinks that there's a roughly 50-50 chance that there'll be a leadership challenge to his prime ministership by the autumn, that is, I guess, August, September, for my Australian viewers, such as they are. Who knows whether that is so, and who knows who it might be. It's not clear who would be a realistic challenger to Boris Johnson right now in the Conservative Party. Dominic Raab, a relatively heavy hitter, has kind of shot his bolt. Who knows? Who knows? Anyway, we will see. He is not, that is to say, Andrew Neil is not particularly optimistic about some aspects of the UK's prospects, and he notes that now in Europe, including the UK, gas prices are now 15 times what they are in the United States. I'll say that again, 15 times higher. That is utterly bizarre, especially because in the UK there are significant reserves of gas which are available to be used by means of fracking. Fracking is a technique which is widely used in the United States without any ill effect. There are, of course, the occasional scare stories about it, but the evidence is overwhelming. Fracking is both effective and safe, and if the UK government were to permit it, then gas in the UK would be a fraction of its current price, and that would hugely benefit, of course, the poor. It's difficult to believe that the poor are actually centre stage in the interests of either the Conservative Party or the Labour Party in the UK, both of whom seem to have abandoned their traditional objectives in favour of some mad competition to appear all the greener, to hope that the sun shines or that the wind blows or whatever is necessary for green technologies to produce the power that a modern civilized society needs effectively to operate and to provide the ordinary comforts needed by people of limited means. Be that as it may, Andrew Neil nevertheless predicts that on all sorts of other matrices, the UK is probably going to do really quite well over the next 12 months, certainly better than most of the G7 countries, and that, he thinks, will save Boris. Well, he might be right. Meanwhile, I notice on rather the more weird media, and in particular James Denningpole's podcasts, Jennifer Courier has been expressing her views, somewhat up at the conspiratorial end of the spectrum. She seems to think that Boris Johnson has been captured by some sinister forces, perhaps the Chinese. I think the truth might be rather more prosaic. It's certainly true that Boris Johnson has changed his approach on numerous issues, such as identity cards and so forth. But what would Occam say? Occam famously said the most likely explanation of anything is the simplest. And the simplest explanation, I suspect, is that his wife is exercising considerable influence over his decision-making process. Boris Johnson's libido is a well-documented factor in his behaviour, and it may be that his opportunity to indulge himself in that regard may be governed to at least some extent by the wishes of his wife. We will see. Finally, for the podcast today, I'm turning away from the mainstream press and to mindingthecampus.org, which is a Canadian website which focuses on the case of Professor Francis Widdowson, who has just been fired from Mount Royal University in Canada, not for any misconduct as such, but because she has said some things which apparently fall foul of the current policy of the university in relation to the Indian peoples of Canada. In a piece by Bruce Gilley, Mr. Gilley says, what the Widdowson affair makes plain is that any university that embraces indigenization or decolonialization or racial justice as part of its mission statement is by definition a university that has given up on science, debate and truth-seeking. it cannot escape notice that the very things the activists charged the residential schools with, fostering and perpetrating an abusive environment, forced indoctrination and assimilation into intolerant norms, hostile and violent responses to dissenters, are exactly what these universities have done. I think one has to acknowledge there's a movement in that direction, which is an unhappy start to 2022. Well, one might say an unhappy end to 2021 for Professor Widdowson, who's just been fired for exposing some nonsense. For example, she was looking at a particular grave site where some children had been buried, Indian children at a former Catholic school in Kamloops in the interior of British Columbia. She and a panel of experts debunked the notion that there were mass graves there, pointing out that child mortality for all children in Canada at the time was high, and that pauper cemeteries were the norm for those without family members to claim them. And the article says that earned Widdowson charges of being a genocide denier, the highest accolade for a serious scholar who refuses to be stampeded into historical nonsense. I've got an uncomfortable feeling there's going to be a good deal more historical nonsense in 2022. Let's hope that at some stage the tide will turn, as I believe and have said, the tide has now finally turned on COVID, and we can start getting back to an ordinary life and look forward to a much more sensible 2022. If you have been, thank you for listening.